Penn State On Demand is a service of Penn State Public Broadcasting, and now you can support WPSU when you shop online. Visit WPSU.org/shop to make purchases from national online retailers, and WPSU will receive a portion of the sale with no extra cost to you. So start your online shopping at WPSU.org/shop.
I do some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
don't ever say to her that what about the Chautauqua Institute?
Introductory discussion on the ethical implications of a community.
We're trying to back over.
Currently doing in autism.
Ben Feller, the chief White House correspondent for the Associated Press, has been described as a master of deadline reporting. Raised in Boalsburg, Pennsylvania, he attended Penn State, graduating in 1992 with a degree in journalism. He got his start as a reporter at the Centre Daily Times, Happy Valley's local newspaper, and eventually joined the AP staff as a national education writer. He was named chief White House correspondent in 2006 and has since traveled the world, covering both the Bush and Obama administrations. In 2010, Feller won the Gerald R. Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting on the presidency. His entry featured coverage of Obama's pre-dawn tribute to soldiers returning from war in caskets at Dover Air Force Base. Here's our conversation with Ben Feller. Ben Feller, welcome to the conversation.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And I guess I should really be saying welcome home, because you grew up in Boalsburg, Pennsylvania. You graduated from Penn State. But your path to the White House is really an interesting one. You graduated in 1992 with a degree in journalism, and then worked, as many young journalism majors do, for the local Centre Daily Times newspaper. In 2003, made your way to the Associated Press, and a couple of years later were assigned as the White House correspondent. But that's not where you started off. I mean, you started off as a psychology major.
I did start off as a psychology major, and I grew up here, so coming to Penn State for me was really coming home. And my interest at first was just to learn about the school again in a new way and go through semester to semester. And I was doing fine, having fun and getting good grades. And then as a junior, I spent a semester abroad in Exeter in England and traveled around Europe with friends and came back. And I thought, I don't really know what I'm doing. I was enjoying psychology, but I couldn't really connect with it. I couldn't see a path for me. So I decided at that point I want to do something that I have a passion for and hopefully I have a good skill for. And so I decided to go into journalism and really took it on in my senior year of college. So that was a bit of a risk. But I kind of took those weed-out courses, those harder journalism courses, competing with freshmen. And in fact, I had to sort of compete even to get into the classes.
Well, I read somewhere that you actually dropped all of your psychology classes. So here you were with no credits. You've dropped 15 of them, and you're not sure that you're going to even get into the journalism classes that you need.
I know. That part was scary. I was actually at a bank working there as a teller for the summer, and at that time, this is dating me, but you could only add and drop classes by the phone. And so I didn't realize you had to drop all your classes before you could add some, and none of the classes that I wanted were empty. So I went back after my lunch break, and the other teller said, "How did it go?" I'm like, "I think I just dropped out of school." So I had to kind of work my way back in. And but the good part about that was as a senior, I was very committed to learning this craft of putting together stories, reporting, accuracy, how do you connect with people. And so I was very committed to it, and ended up really devoting all of my time to that. And I went a couple extra semesters and got a job as a stringer, as they call it, with the Centre Daily Times.
Making $15 a story.
$15 a story, and it was glorious. I mean,
to see your name in print.
It was great. Yeah, I mean, I think the first story I had was covering girls' high school basketball. So, but the important thing about that time was I just needed a chance, and I got a chance, and I was very focused on whatever story was in front of me, and that actually was the template for my whole career.
Really, because it sounds like so much of your career has been happenstance, being in the right place at the right time. In 2003, you were working for the AP, as an education reporter. Was that something you were interested in, or was that a job that just happened to be open when you were looking?
Well, it was really both. I mean, by the time I had gotten to Florida and Tampa in 2001, my job there was to cover education, and that was the job that was open. I had done some of it in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. But that's sometimes how it goes. I mean, you become a generalist as a young reporter, and you learn to cover everything, and you learn how to try to make the complicated simple. And then eventually you start to pick up some subject matter expertise, and in that case it was education. So I did that for a couple years in Tampa. And then I was very interested in coming home to the Northeast to a major newspaper, and then I found out the Associated Press, which serves all the newspapers, had a national education job open. So it was a bit of serendipity there, but it was also a product of everything I had done, and it worked out really well because I got to write for a larger audience and take on bigger issues, and that's what continues to interest me.
And in fact, you have had to become an expert in so many things, covering two presidents at this point. Right. You cover their domestic, foreign, and political agendas. And if you look at just the last 6 months of President Obama's presidency and the issues, the worldwide crises he's had to deal with, what does that mean for you as a reporter reporting on what he does?
Well, the upside of that is that, of course, you're writing about events as they happen, and you're being able to explain all of these events that are coming through the White House to the American audience and the broader audience. So all of that effort you put into trying to figure out what is happening at the White House pays off because you know that you're affecting people's lives. The stressful part of that is you don't come into work thinking, okay, today I'm going to write about
Libya.
Yeah, but Libya is a very good example, and before that it was Egypt, and before that we had a state visit the president of China, and before that you had this horrible shooting of the congresswoman from Arizona, and it just continues to go on. The issues change every day. And so you just have to get adept at learning how to figure out what the right background is for the story and who to talk to and sort of getting up to speed. And as you follow an issue like Libya, your understanding of it, your sourcing of the matter gets deeper and deeper. But, of course, by the time you've done that, you're on to something else.
Tell us about your first interaction with each president. President Bush first.
My first interaction with President Bush was almost by accident. I was asked to fill in on a trip that he was taking to the West Coast, and this was a trip based in Colorado, and it was focusing, or he wanted it to focus on energy. And there was a big controversy happening back in Washington where his own party was rebelling against him. This had to do with who was going to take over security of these seaports, and it was a question of whether an Arab company should have the right. And President Bush felt very strongly that this was a case of right and wrong. So we were flying back home on Air Force One, and he decided to give a statement on the plane to the press pool, which is the small group of reporters traveling with the president. So we were just hoping to get some sort of statement from the press secretary, but instead they said, you guys come up front with us. And we got called into the conference room, and the president came in, and he recognized everybody except for me.
The new guy.
Yeah, and he said, don't know you. And that's actually when I had started to run my tape. So the first thing you hear is, don't know you, from the President of the United States. And I said, Mr. President, I'm Ben Feller of the AP. He goes, all right, Ben, why don't you come sit next to me? AP likes to sit up front. And there was one empty seat there next to him, and I got some grief from that from the others. But that was my introduction to President Bush. And he said, good to see you, thanks for coming, which was a funny thing to say, I thought, because, well, of course I'm going to come. Where else am I going to be? I'm on your plane. So he gave a statement, and then he said, okay, I'll take some questions. And I said, well, you've made very clear what your position is, but what will you do if Congress tries to stop you? He said, they should listen to me too, Ben. And if they don't, they pass a law, I'll veto it. And I thought, that's great. I mean, it's not great, the veto, but, it's great that we had a very clear interaction, and it was news. I got news out of him. And, we had to get the news out quickly, and everything happened pretty fast, but it went smoothly. And that actually showed something to my bosses and helped get me to the White House meeting. My first interaction with President Obama was nothing that really stood out initially. I was already at the White House, and he came in with his team. So I had to get to know them, but the Obama administration also had to get to know the White House press corps, some of whom were on their campaign, but some weren't. So I got to see him a lot, but I was sort of part of this mass for a while. You could just tell. You know, I saw him at I was covering one of his trips, and we were in, I think it was actually in Ghana, and I got to the lobby early and had breakfast, and he was coming down to the gym with his Secret Service agents, and I just ran right into him. I said, "Good morning, Mr. President," and he goes, "Hey, guys." And I looked around, I'm like, there are no guys, it's just me.
You.
But he was so used to sort of seeing us as a group. And then over time, a matter of weeks or months, I had opportunities to stand up and ask him questions and be around him. And then I had a lunch with him and a couple other reporters. And, now we have a very traditional relationship.
What goes into asking that very first question? Because as we both know, the first question can set the tone for how the entire press conference will go.
That's right. It's one of the most difficult parts of the job, and I think it's one of the most underrated parts of any reporter's job, is figuring out the right question. In the case of asking President Obama a question, or President Bush before him, you have to think about what's the one question you can ask, because that's the only chance you get. And if you ask him something that leads to his saying what he said before, you've really lost an opportunity. I mean, it's a tremendously deflating feeling. So you actually have to go through an exercise and say, if I ask this, what's he likely to say? And if that leads him down to talking points, you say, well, that's not the right question. If we frame it this way, he's compelled to sort of open up into a new territory. And if he doesn't, we can say, but Mr. President, you didn't answer my question. President Obama has a kind of a knack for going off on what he wants to talk about, but invariably he will remember what you said and bring it back around. And so it sort of works both ways. But it's a very stressful part of the job. On the other hand, if you do ask the right question and he answers in a way that adds to the information we know about the White House, then you've done your job.
Now, your office is literally in the Oval Office. Meanwhile, there is an AP Bureau office in Washington, D.C., so you're leading this team, AP team, from the White House. And you said something interesting once that bears repeating, and that is, I work at the White House, but I don't work for the White House. How difficult is that balancing act when, if you ask a question with the wrong tone or wrong timing, you might not get the same opportunities again?
Well, there's definitely that tension, particularly on difficult stories and on days when things aren't necessarily going well for the White House. But I also think that the people at the White House have a healthy respect for the dividing line and for what we do. So we, the White House Press Corps, are based in the West Wing. And there's only so many places we could go, whereas the White House employees have much more freedom. But I think they understand that we don't work for them, and certainly we understand it and never let that be confused. I really haven't had a case where something I've asked has caused me to get less access, or at least to my knowledge. Certainly there have been times, including one time with President Obama, where I've asked a question that was, I thought, very fair but pointed about a change in position. And I was asking him, why should people believe you when you take a stand if you're going to flip-flop? And he pushed back on that, and it was part of a very energetic news conference. And then it so happened that later that night was the White House Christmas party for the press corps. And so we all get a chance to have one moment with him. And it was clear it was on his mind what I had asked a couple hours earlier. He said something like, so you started things off today? And I said, yes, I did, and let me introduce you to my mom.
Deflect that, right?
We both moved on, yeah.
Describe, if you would, or compare the difference between a President Bush White House and a President Obama White House in terms of your role in the press.
Well, I think the important thing to remember is that every White House is looking, as it relates to working with the press corps, to promote its interest. So it's not as if when the White House comes to a briefing, it's just, here's the facts, here's what we know about the oil spill, let us answer your questions, and that's that. They want to present the case that they want to the American people. They want to present a case that they've been responsive and that they're listening and that they're in command. And so you always have to keep that in mind. I mean, there is a promotional context to those. But there are also people there who are working very hard and who have to be held accountable and who know that they're on the record and what they're saying is going to come back to haunt them if they're not presenting the best information. So I think that's kind of the context that carries over, in my case, from President Bush's White House to the Obama White House is that there's this understanding that we're trying to get the information and hold power accountable, but do it in a fair way. And they're trying to present us information, but also, I mean, this is a political environment. They want people to think that they're handling things well, and in the case of a first-term president, they want to get reelected. So all of those factors go in the mix. I think if you step back from it, they do have a sense of responsibility to be fair to us, and we to them. And, you know, because we're there every day, there really isn't any buffer. I mean, they see how we are. They see whether we're professional and whether we're responsible. They see our stories or our pieces on TV. So if they don't think we're handling it well, you know, they have a way to judge us or take away our access. And the same thing for us. You know, if they're not really being responsive, we have ways to deal with that. I mean, we can present it to them. It really doesn't serve them well to just sort of say, we're not going to deal with you.
What's a typical day shadowing a U.S. president? And I ask that by saying first that under President Bush, the day started at 6:45, and you said lights out by 9:30, 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
President Obama is very different.
Well, the two men are very different. What was sort of a symbolic start to that transition was literally right after the inauguration of President Obama. There were no pictures on the walls, and all of the desks were empty. And the Obama staff came in and they figured out where they were going to sit, and some people couldn't get into their drawers. They had no idea how to really work the phones. Their email wasn't working on the front day, and you think, well, this is the White House, right? That surely there's all these kinds of transitions, and it really does start fresh. And then you see people come in and sit in these seats, and you're like, well, that's where so-and-so used to sit. But it's just an entirely new government, and you can feel it from day one. So then it becomes, all right, well, what's the rhythm of this place? And for President Obama, he starts his public day later, and you know, he has two young but growing girls, so he tends to have dinner with them, and then he goes back to work at night, and he'll work at speeches and go through his briefing book, you know, way into the evening. He's more of a night owl. President Bush was extraordinarily disciplined in a different way. He loved to get up early, loved to exercise very early, and be in the Oval Office, and he had a different kind of dress code even, you know, about requiring that a suit coat be
more
worn.
Formal.
Much more formal, you know. And so every White House takes on the attitude of the president, the hours you keep, how the staff interacts, and you know, it's just fascinating to be able to see those changes.
You said once in an interview that you did with the Penn Stater magazine that sometimes you feel that you're, quote, in a struggle with the White House for information, and that you walk down your driveway at the end of the evening sometimes and wonder, I'm not sure I won the battle today.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to overstate for me how difficult the job is for that reason. I mean, there are a lot of different parts of the job, if you do it well, that make it hard, and it should be hard. I mean, we're traveling around the world, and all the issues that you raised earlier that we have to know about and write about with quickly and with precision and with accuracy. But again, it's not as if the White House is just saying, let us provide you the information and do the best job you can with it. We're asking for things all the time that they aren't able to answer, or they're not willing to answer, or they eventually answer, but not when we need it, you know, past our deadline or days later. So sometimes you think, well, I really didn't ask the right person the right question, or if I could just reach more people, if I could get that one person to return my call. And if you don't do it well, you're still able to do your job, but you leave that place at night, walking down the driveway, headed out to Pennsylvania Avenue, thinking, God, I don't think I won the battle for information today.
Now, you followed the president literally all over the world, and I wonder, with you always trailing him, is there ever time to follow a backstory?
It's difficult. I mean, you sometimes find the backstory out later. There are times when the president has made a decision and the White House is being very secretive up until the point the decision has made. And then if you could find the right people, you find out, well, actually, we had a late night meeting at this point, and there was a conference call, and you think, oh, okay, I was wondering what was happening that night. You know, and then you sort of put the trail back together afterward about how a decision was made. And sometimes that has to do with the handling of a natural disaster. Oftentimes, particularly as it relates to matters of war, the White House struggles with the press corps about reading out what's happening in those Situation Room meetings. And President Obama had a long trail to making his decision to send more troops into Afghanistan. So the backstory often comes after the fact, and you get folks to say, this is how this came together. Now, again, sometimes they're doing that because they want to show a very thoughtful, engaged, open process, and that's not always the case. But the story, I guess, the backstory often comes out after.
You, speaking of President Bush, you did an analysis of President Bush, an analysis of his personality that I think showed President Bush in a different light than many people knew him in. One of the things you said about him was really how thoughtful he was. He was actually a very curious person, and that didn't come through maybe to other people, and that his top aides said that was one of their greatest regrets, is that
Right.
people didn't realize that about him.
Yeah. Well, President Bush, in some settings, just didn't come across very well, and even the White House in private moments would admit that. The interactions with the press, particularly press conferences sometimes, I had a top aide once tell me that they thought he would get sort of too caffeinated. I mean, the lights are on and everything is about sort of that moment, and it doesn't always make for the best time to say, let me explain this thoughtfully. And in President Bush, that became part of his reputation. What the people who work with him day to day behind the scenes would tell us was that, well, that's not the whole picture, right? You have a leader here who spends a lot of time asking questions to get to the heart of the issue. And we wish that you guys would report that. And we wish that you guys would see that. And I said, well, you can help us with the latter part by giving us more access to him and giving us more ability to see it so that we can
Did he
reflect on our
respond to
coverage.
that piece?
No. Well, actually what happened was I wrote 2 end of the Bush presidency analyses that ran about a week apart. And what was interesting is that this was at a time when almost nobody was paying attention to that because a new president was about to take over. So this was sort of during that whole wave of President Obama and his new cabinet. So the personality piece ran, and then I wrote another piece that was a look at his policies that was very tough and sort of saying, here's how he left the country. I never really heard from President Bush about any particular piece, or President Obama. That usually comes, filtered down. I think they thought that it was good that we showed different sides of his personality. They were a lot less pleased with the policy piece.
You've won a number of awards for your reporting on the presidency and have been described as a master of deadline reporting. In fact, have been compared, reminiscent to Edwin R. Murrow, which must have been a day maker for you when you heard that.
A year maker. Yeah. Yeah.
But what's it like being under the gun all the time?
It's part of the job. So I actually have to remind myself of that sometimes, that this is what I do. This is what I've signed on for. I have signed on for this because it's not so much being on deadline for a particular story. It's that, as you said, you're always on deadline. So it doesn't really allow you much opportunity to rest. And I don't mean just physically resting, but kind of allow your mind to rest and think about the bigger picture, or what are the issues that I would be covering if I just had more time. At the AP, as the chief person for the White House, you really need to be able to operate in the deadline environment. And so even last night, the speech that the president gave on Libya was extremely important, and had to turn that around very quickly. He spoke at 7:30, and we had a finished story out very soon, so that it could get out and to run on the front pages of newspapers. That happens in some way every day, and sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. So,
and every second matters. You're calling in some details of the story just to save 15 seconds.
It really does. It really does matter. I mean, particularly at the AP, where accuracy is the most important factor, but people count on us to be able to say what's happening first.
And speaking of counting on you, there are over 1 billion people worldwide who rely on stories provided by the AP. Does that sometimes feel like an enormous responsibility? Does it feel like a daunting thing to be doing day in and day out?
It's too big of a number and too big of an audience to really think about that way. I mean, so what feels daunting to me is that sense of coming into the White House every day. And in fact, I'm kind of glad about that. I'm glad that I've been there for over 4 years, and it doesn't feel like I'm just showing up to work. you know, you go through the gate and you go through the screening with the Secret Service, and then you're walking down that driveway and you feel like, okay, you know, I have to lead this. And I have to find out what's happening, and sometimes the call comes in from my editor, you know, what do we know about what they're deciding on Afghanistan? Well, that's a tough question, you know. Okay, what's he going to say later on in this economic speech? Well, you sort of have to navigate your way all through those things. I feel that heaviness more so than I do, oh my gosh, I can't believe how many people are going to read this, you know. I mean, I guess for me the lesson was when I started at the Associated Press in Washington writing for a national audience and an international audience, and I met somebody at a public relations firm who one day printed out one of my first stories on education and just sent me the packet. She printed out every single story she could find from every newspaper that had run that story, and it was like an inch thick, and I'm like, okay, that's enough. You know, people are seeing my work.
But by the time some people see this program, you will be a father, which I hope I'm not letting something out of the bag.
Well, I'll be a father in June, so that's
well,
right, that's right.
So. Okay,
that's right.
So I'm just wondering, is this something you see as a long-time career? Or is this a young man's job?
Well, I can't answer that question. I really can't. I'm starting to wrestle with it because I love my work and I am very passionate about it. But I also know enough about me. I'm 40 years old, and I'm very blessed to be able to start a family. And, you know, that kid's going to come first. So what I need to do is to try to figure out what works. I feel very confident I'm going to be able to do that with my wife. I know that the job is not going to change, and the demands are still going to be very early in the morning and late at night. I'm just going to try to find a way to make it work, and if not, I'll adjust. But right now, I'm very happy being a White House correspondent, and I'm even happier to be becoming a dad.
Well, very nice talking with you.
Thank you very much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Ben Feller. Comcast subscribers can watch this program anytime on Penn State On Demand. Find out how through our website, conversations.psu.edu, where you'll also find more information and articles of Feller's White House coverage. I'm Patty Satalia. Join us for our next Conversation from Penn State.
If you've enjoyed Conversations from Penn State and would like to purchase a DVD of this show or any of our other episodes, order online at mediasales.psu.edu or call 1-800-770-2111.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU.